Welcome back to Luke's Properties YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how you can replace your income with just one rent-to-rent property. Let's get into it. Okay, so firstly, you have to have your company set up professionally, you have to be compliant and have all of the relevant insurances in place. You also need to understand exactly how rent-to-rent works, and you need to be able to communicate the value in your service. You need to be able to sell yourself. You need to be able to explain how your service can add value to landlords and solve their problems. Now for me, it took me around 6 months to get to that stage. From realizing I wanted to build a rent-to-rent business, to setting my company up, and then being able to communicate my service to landlords, that whole process took me around 6 to 7 months. I was trying to get all of that done in a shorter amount of time, but the truth is, these things do take some time. You have to give your brain some time to really digest the knowledge, and then you have to put the knowledge into action and actually start implementing things. And you have to actually get good, and the only way to get good is by practicing. For most of my success students, this process also takes around 6 months. So bear that in mind and set yourself a realistic time frame so that you don't feel disappointed and discouraged when things don't go your way sooner, which will then make you give up. So once you're at that stage, you've set yourself up, you understand how to communicate the service properly, you then need to find the right people to pitch your service to. You need to find your ideal customer and you need to understand them. So in this instance, your ideal customer is going to be an HMO landlord, preferably a landlord of a tired old HMO property, but more importantly, they need to be experiencing some problems as a landlord. If they're not experiencing a problem, then it's going to be hard for you to sell your solution because they don't need it. If they've got a brand new HMO with a house full of tenants, all paying premium rents, then it's going to be quite difficult for you to pitch your service to them as they don't really need it. Things are going good. Your ideal customer needs to be experiencing some problems so that you can then come in and offer your solution. So typical problems that these types of landlords will be experiencing will be void periods, so periods of time where some of the rooms will be empty. And these types of problems can be costly to landlords. If you haven't got a tenant in one of your rooms, then as a landlord, that means you're missing out on making money, or even potentially you're losing money. Another typical problem that these landlords experience will be tenant arrears. Now quite often with old tired HMOs, the landlords of those HMOs have normally targeted DSS tenants, tenants that don't have a job basically. And oftentimes with these tenants, there can be late rent payments and they can fall into arrears. And sometimes the income that they get, they use for other things rather than paying the rent. This can result in tenants falling behind and it creates arrears. So as a landlord, you have your mortgage to pay, you have your bills to pay. And when a tenant falls behind with paying their rent, you still have to pay your mortgage every month as a landlord. You still have to pay all of the running costs associated with the property, regardless of whether your tenants have paid rent or not. So tenants falling into rent arrears is a huge problem for landlords. Another issue with being an HMO landlord is maintenance. Now typically with any property, there's always going to be a level of maintenance that's needed. The smaller the property and the less tenants there are in the property, the less maintenance is needed. But when you're talking about a large HMO property like this one, you've got 10 separate units, 10 separate tenants, and it's a big building. So sometimes there can be lots of wear and tear and lots of maintenance. And as an HMO landlord, this can be another problem because people buy properties initially to grow their wealth, but also to benefit from a passive income stream. And when you're constantly dealing with maintenance, you're constantly dealing with tenant arrears, empty rooms and void periods, that passive income element that you initially planned for starts to go out the window because you're constantly at the property, trying to fix the maintenance issues, chasing tenants up for late rent payments, trying to fill those empty rooms, and that dream of getting passive income every week without having to do anything starts to disappear because you become very much involved in the day-to-day run-ins of the property. And when you're in a situation like this with some empty rooms, not only are you working harder than you should be, but you're also breaking even or maybe even losing money. And that isn't what people get into property for. People get into property for passive income and to build wealth, not to work harder and become a busy fool, and certainly not to lose money, especially if you've invested 50, 60, 70, even £100,000 into this type of property. The last thing you want to be doing is losing money every month. Another problem that landlords go through is HMO compliance. Now, over the last 5 to 10 years, compliance and rules for HMOs have kept changing and becoming more and more stringent. The benchmark for a compliant HMO has just kept rising, and it's costing landlords more and more money to stay compliant and to work within the HMO regulations within their chosen investment area. Again, this is another costly and time-consuming thing That takes up a lot of landlords' energy and again pulls them away from their dream of a hassle-free investment that just pays them passive income every month. So these types of problems leave landlords in a position where they basically have an underperforming asset. And by the way guys, I haven't just made up this scenario out of thin air. This is actually a real case study of one of my HMO properties. This is the exact scenario that I found this landlord in, and as we go through the video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I solved these problems for this landlord, and as a result of that, I now get paid £2,000 every single month from this landlord's property. So make sure you stay tuned to the end, make some notes, and try and use some of these tips in your own rent-to-rent business. So let's talk about how I found this landlord. I found this landlord by marketing to them. I wrote them a personalised letter explaining to them very simply how I'd love to view their property, get to know them a bit, and then make them an offer. Now, after I sent them a letter, a couple weeks later, this landlord contacted me and they asked me if I wanted to come and view the property. So that's exactly what I did. I went and viewed the property, and this was the exact state that the property was in. It wasn't in very good condition, and the landlord only had 5 out of 10 rooms tenanted. He was midway through a refurbishment. He was actually halfway through putting en-suites in them and getting them up to a standard. So not only was he losing money from these problems that he was experiencing, he was also trying to spend money on improving the condition of the property. Now, when you're losing money and spending money on something, you can quite quickly start to feel like, is this thing even worth it? And that's the position that this landlord had got themselves into. So because he only had half of the property filled with tenants and the other half empty, his gross income, bearing in mind he was renting to DSS tenants, and I think back then the amount the DSS tenants would get from the government to cover their rent was around £300 per person per month, which meant that the landlord's gross income at the time when I met him was £1,500. Now, his mortgage payment was around £1,000 a month on an interest-only mortgage, and the running costs added up to around £500 a month, which meant that basically he was breaking even. Imagine that. He had probably had to put down around £50,000 to £100,000 to buy this property initially, and somehow he had got himself into this situation where he wasn't even making any money. Yes, the asset was going up over time and growing his wealth, which is always a good thing, but in terms of the cash flow and how much he was making every month, he was only breaking even. So he wasn't actually making any profit. So the landlord got my letter, we arranged a viewing, I went and met him at the property, I walked around the property with him, he told me the plan to put en-suites into the empty rooms. I made notes of all the problems that he was experiencing. I took videos and photos of the property, and I told him I'd be in touch shortly. I then went back to the office with my notes of all the problems that he was experiencing. I put the property numbers into my deal analyzer spreadsheet, and then I worked out how I could add value to him, and I put together an offer. Now, rather than email that offer over, I went and met that landlord a couple weeks later for a coffee at his local health club. So we sat down, we both had our notepads there, and we went back and forth, explaining to each other what an ideal scenario would look like. He explained to me exactly where he wanted the property to be, where he wanted to get to, and what he wanted from his asset long term. I then explained to him where I thought we could add value to him, what my vision for the property was, and where I would like to be with the property, and how I thought I could help over the long term. We went back and forth, we agreed on some things, we disagreed on others, and after about 45 minutes to an hour, we came to a compromise and we made an agreement. And the agreement was as follows. The landlord would continue to put the en-suites into these rooms. We would assist in helping him evict these tenants that weren't paying the rent. We would also put some of our own money into the property to improve the perceived value of it. The landlord agreed to get these rooms up to a standard that we could work with, which at the time they were being replastered. He was putting en-suites into the rooms. We would then come in, put in the finishing touches, put in the soft furnishings. I even remember offering for my dad to lay new flooring. The landlord bought the material and my dad laid the flooring for free, which was a nice touch and a nice sweetener to the deal. So now the landlord had some help. He had someone in me that he knew would help him and wouldn't make him face all of these problems alone, which I think at the time gave him huge relief. Now, this landlord was a good landlord. He's a good man. He actually has a portfolio of these properties, but this particular HMO was probably his worst one out of 4 or 5. His other HMOs are closer to a hospital, and he never had problems with filling those rooms. Because it was opposite a hospital, he always had nurses and doctors staying there. So those houses pretty much took care of themselves. But because this property was located around half a mile to a mile down the road in a slightly worse area, for whatever reason, this property had become a problem for him. And he realized that he needed some help, which I think is quite smart and quite intelligent. He'd already made his wealth in property because he's owned this portfolio of HMOs for over 20 years. So he's had a lot of capital appreciation and he's received a lot of rent over the years. But he'd got himself into a situation where one of his assets was underperforming and he realized he needed some help to get it back up to a performing asset. And there's no harm in asking for help at times. And fortunately for us and him, we were there with a service that could help solve all of his problems. So as soon as the en-suites were finished in these rooms and the rooms were plastered, painted and decorated, we then took things from there. We laid the flooring in some of these rooms, furnished all of the rooms, then put soft furnishings in the rooms and started marketing the property aggressively on all the correct platforms. So not just Rightmove and Zoopla like most estate agents would, but we were marketing on Spare Room. We were also marketing on Booking.com, Airbnb. Initially, we weren't quite sure if we were going to rent it to short-term guests or long-term tenants. So we tested a few different platforms to see which strategy would work best. So our agreement with the landlord was we would give him a guaranteed rent for the empty rooms and work with him to remove the problem tenants, which we would then replace with professional tenants. So we offered the landlord a guaranteed rent of £200 per room. And we would then become the long-term tenant that he craved because we guaranteed the rent over 1 to 5 years. So our solution to his problems were that we were guaranteeing the rent, we were one long-term tenant, we would also handle minor maintenance, so nothing structural, but mainly minor maintenance up to a certain percentage of the rent. So for example, if we make around £2,000 a month in profit from the property, we would put aside 5% of that for minor maintenance every year. So if we made £24,000, then we'd put aside around £1,200 to cover the minor maintenance of the property, which would make the income even more passive for the landlord because not only does he have to not worry about tenants now, he also doesn't have to worry about minor maintenance because we're going to cover up to 5%. Obviously, if something else went wrong that was more expensive, like the windows or the structure of the building or the boiler breaking, then that would still fall under a landlord obligation. But to know that the minor maintenance would be covered by us, I think was quite reassuring for the landlord. We'd also assist the landlord with HMO compliance. So when the HMO licensing officer would visit the property to renew the HMO license, they'd give the landlord a long list of improvements that needed to be made to the property. And the landlord needed different trades with different expertise to complete the list that the HMO officer had given him. So we'd also help with the HMO compliance of the property. So before we had met the landlord, the HMO licensing officer had visited the property to give the landlord a list of works that needed to be completed so that the property could reach current HMO licensing standards. And this list was quite overwhelming for the landlord. It was a longer list than he expected. Most of the jobs were only small jobs, but the landlord needed different trades to fix different issues in the property. And although he had a couple of old trusted tradesmen in his network, he realized that he needed more. And because we'd been working in the area with other properties and we'd been networking for months and months prior to meeting this landlord, we had tradesmen that could help him. So we helped the landlord fix all of the issues by using some of the tradesmen in our network. And we made sure they gave him the fairest price possible, which again, I think he appreciated. So we guaranteed the rent, we became one long-term tenant, we handled minor maintenance, we assisted with HMO compliance, and ultimately the pitch was to turn the asset from an underperforming asset into a high-performing asset. Now here's what we did to get there in summary. We changed the tenant type. So we helped the landlord get rid of these bad tenants that weren't paying, and we then replaced those tenants with working professional tenants that were going to pay a higher rent. We invested £6,000 of our own money into the refurbishment. Again, our part of the refurbishment was mainly cosmetic. We did do some painting and decorating here and there. As I mentioned, we did lay some flooring, but most of that £6,000 invested went into furniture and improving the perceived value of the property. We started paying for the empty rooms. So the empty rooms that the landlord had, we started giving him £200 a month as soon as they were in rentable condition. We improved the product and added value. We increased the rent and ultimately we made the landlord more money with less hassle. Now here's the result of that. So 10 rooms, all fully tenanted with working professionals, paying around £500 per room, which took the gross income to £5,000 a month. We agreed to pay the landlord £2,000 a month, which was £200 a room, in guaranteed rent, which was £2,000 a month. The bills, so gas, electric, council tax, water, we put high-speed Wi-Fi in there too. Those cost us £1,000, which meant that after all of the expenses, we were left with £2,000 a month in net profit, which is basically the same as the average salary in the UK. So we did all of this work, we added all of this value to the landlord, we solved all of his problems, and as a result of this, we ended up making £2,000 a month in net profit, which is enough to replace the average salary in the UK from one rent-to-rent property. That takes us around an hour a week to run. Obviously, all of this work that we did in the beginning, we had to spend around 2 to 3 hours a day focusing on just this property alone, helping the landlord solve all of these problems. But once they were all solved, once we'd improved the property with the landlord, once we changed the tenant type, once we'd improved the product and added value and increased the rent, this was the result. 10 full rooms, all tenanted with working professionals, all paying an increased rent, which resulted in the landlord getting £2,000 a month in guaranteed rent and resulted in us getting £2,000 a month in profit. Now the landlord still had to pay his £1,000 mortgage, but we were now taking care of the bills. So the £2,000 that we would give him, out of that he'd pay the mortgage, and then he'd be left with £1,000 every single month in passive income that works out to be complete profit without doing a thing, which works out to be the hassle-free solution to landlording that we promised him in the first place. Now the key points here are that we turned £8,000 if you include the £6,000 we invested plus the £2,000 that we gave the landlord initially for the first month of guaranteed rent. We turned £8,000 into £24,000 a year, which over 5 years has worked out to be £120,000. So we've turned £8,000 into £120,000. We solved multiple problems with solutions. We've created true passive income for the landlord with our hassle-free service. We've turned an underperforming asset into a top performing asset. We've added value to the landlord, shared the workload, and then eventually, after all of that work, we've then got paid. Now this was quite a long video, so if you've made it this far, then well done to you. And I hope by watching this video, you can now understand how you can replace your 9-to-5 income from just one rent-to-rent property. If you want me to help you do this yourself, then I'll put a link in the video description below. If you click the link, you'll be able to book a free call with myself, and on that call, we can map out the next steps for you. There's thousands and thousands of landlords out there in this exact same position, and they need organized, competent people who know what they're doing with energy to come and help them. So if you feel like you can fill that role, then this could be you in 6 months to a year's time. You could be making £2,000 a month from someone else's property from only putting in around an hour a week of work. So if you want me to help you get there, then click the link in the video description below and book a call. I'd love to help you reach your goals. If you want to watch another video where I break down exactly how to set your rent-to-rent business up step by step, then watch this video next. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.